Dawn broke cold and gray over the barbed wire fences of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, on October 12, 1943. The frost clung to the guard towers, rifles glinted with dew, and the sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed across the compound. Inside the rows of wooden barracks, hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war stirred from their bunks, wrapped in thin blankets, unsure of what fresh humiliation or labor awaited them. For men raised under an imperial creed that demanded silence and obedience in captivity, every morning felt like a slow unraveling of their warrior identity. Yet on this day, something different occurred. A sergeant walked in not with shackles but with paper, ink and small-bound notebooks. He handed them out like rations. "You are allowed to write," he said flatly. The prisoners stared in disbelief, their faces unreadable masks trained by discipline, but their eyes flickered with shock. For Japanese soldiers, many who believed death preferable to capture, the idea of keeping personal journals under enemy supervision bordered on the impossible. And yet, here on American soil, pens were placed into the hands of men once sworn to die for the Emperor, U.S. Army Camp Records, Oct. 1943. The guards themselves seemed almost casual about the decision. An American lieutenant, a former schoolteacher from Ohio, told his men that allowing diaries was good for morale and order. What he did not realize was that to these captured Japanese soldiers, it was not a kindness, but a riddle. In their homeland, diaries were deeply private artifacts, sometimes burned before battle to prevent shameful secrets from surviving their deaths. Now their conquerors not only permitted it, but encouraged it. The strangeness of this act spread like wildfire in whispers across the camp yard. Why would they let us write? Do they want to read our thoughts? Some muttered in hushed tones. Others wondered if it was a trick, a psychological ploy to test loyalty or gather intelligence. Still others, silent, simply clutched the blank pages, unsure whether to scrawl or to resist. Bundesarchiv, Prisoner Interrogations, 1947. To understand the weight of that moment, one must remember the context of 1943. The Pacific War had already carved scars across oceans and jungles. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Aleutians had proven the ferocity of combat when Japanese troops fought to the last breath. The Imperial Army had drilled into its men that capture was a fate worse than death. Manuals instructed soldiers to commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. Many believed that surrender would mean torture, starvation, or dishonor. So great their families would be shunned. Yet here in the frozen heartland of America, they were not beaten, flogged, or executed. Instead, they were fed, clothed, and now, most disturbingly, permitted to write their innermost reflections. The contradiction gnawed at their sense of reality. Imperial Japanese Army Code of Conduct, 1938. The guards observed the prisoners with a mix of curiosity and detachment. To them, these men were just another batch of captives, among hundreds of thousands held across the continental United States. By 1945, more than 425,000 Axis POWs, Italians, Germans, and Japanese would be confined in nearly 700 camps stretching from Texas cotton fields to Minnesota forests. U.S. War Department Report, 1945. But the Japanese prisoners were unique. Their numbers were far fewer, only about 5,000 in America at the peak of the war, and their cultural distance was profound. Unlike German prisoners who sometimes sang folk songs or even joined work crews willingly, Japanese captives carried silence like armor. Many refused to speak of their families, their commanders, or even their battles. They existed in a shadow world where shame drowned out voice. That silence made the introduction of diaries even more surreal. The first entries historians would later find were tentative. Some prisoners described the cold, the food, white bread, canned meat, strange coffee that left a bitter taste. Others recorded observations of the guards, their relaxed posture, their cigarettes, their odd way of laughing even in duty. One prisoner wrote of watching an American guard teaching another how to throw a baseball during a quiet shift. "They are careless but not cruel," the entry read. A line preserved decades later in a museum archive. Japanese POW diary fragment, Camp McCoy collection. But what struck the guards most was not the content, which they seldom checked in detail, but the simple fact that the prisoners embraced the practice at all. Within weeks, nearly every Japanese inmate carried a small notebook, scribbling at night by dim light bulbs. their shadows stretching across the barrack walls. Behind the barbed wire, those journals became lifelines. Some used them to reconstruct battles they had fought, names of comrades lost or letters they would never send home. Others filled the pages with poems, sketches of the camp, or philosophical musings about fate and survival. The act of writing, unthinkable in the chaos of jungle warfare, now became a daily ritual. To the Americans, it was harmless. To the Japanese, it was paradoxical freedom within captivity. For men stripped of honor, the journal became a surrogate battlefield, where memory and reflection replaced the sword. U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division Report, 1944. Yet disbelief remained constant. Many prisoners struggled to understand the motivation behind the policy. In the Imperial Army, a soldier's personal words could be seen as weakness, a distraction from duty. Diaries were sometimes seized and destroyed by officers. In contrast, the Americans seemed almost indifferent. One guard even joked, "Maybe one day you'll write a book about how well we treated you." Such statements baffled the prisoners. In their worldview, the enemy's role was to dominate, to humiliate, to erase. But here their captors offered ink instead of chains. "It is beyond comprehension," a prisoner later recalled in post-war testimony, "that we were given voice when our own officers had taken it from us." Post-war POW testimony. Tokyo, 1951. By late 1943, word of these allowances spread to other camps. In places like Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico and Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Japanese prisoners reported similar astonishment. Some American commanders believed encouraging diaries helped keep order. Others viewed it as a subtle form of intelligence gathering. After all, even the most guarded reflections could reveal morale, loyalties, or hidden networks. But the broader truth was simpler. The American military had chosen a strategy of relative leniency, rooted in both practicality and propaganda. Treating POWs humanely was not just a moral choice, it was a calculated move to demonstrate American superiority and contrast with Japanese brutality toward Allied prisoners. In the Pacific, U.S. Office of War Information Memo, 1944. Still, the paradox cut both ways. For Japanese prisoners, every word written carried risk. What if their journals were seized after the war? What if family members discovered they had admitted weakness, longing, or even admiration for the enemy? For some, the very act of writing became a hidden rebellion against imperial doctrine. In their notebooks, they confessed hunger, fatigue, even fleeting relief at being alive. Such honesty would have been unthinkable in uniform. Now it became ink on paper that might outlast them all. Japanese Cultural Anthropological Study, 1962. The American guards often underestimated the significance of what they had permitted. To them, it was no different from handing out extra rations or allowing prisoners to listen to music on a camp radio. But in those quiet pages, entire worlds were taking shape. The soldiers who had once sworn never to surrender were mapping their inner landscapes, recording thoughts that would one day astonish historians. Decades later, when some of these journals resurfaced, scholars described them as voices rescued from silence, testimony not only of war, but of the strange collision of cultures inside America's wartime fences. Smithsonian Oral History, 1987. And yet, as 1943 gave way to 1944, the question still lingered among the prisoners themselves. Why would their captors allow this? What secret advantage did the Americans see in diaries? What hidden calculation lay behind this freedom of words? For the Japanese, the mystery deepened with every page filled, every notebook tucked under a thin mattress. It was not simply paper. It was a puzzle, one they feared they had not yet solved. The answer to that puzzle, and the deeper strategic logic behind it, would not be revealed until much later, on a battlefield far from the quiet barracks of Wisconsin. It was there, amid fire and steel, that the true purpose of such unexpected freedoms would finally come into focus. In the winter of 1944, as snow blanketed the wire-fenced compounds of America's prisoner of war camps, the mystery of the journals began to take on a sharper edge. What seemed at first like a curious leniency was in fact part of a far deeper strategy. Allowing prisoners to write was not an oversight of discipline, it was a calculated advantage. Every stroke of ink, every half-hidden confession scribbled in those notebooks, gave the Americans something the Japanese themselves had failed to grasp: insight into the minds of their enemy. By opening the door to expression, the guards were, in truth, unlocking a window into morale, loyalty, and psychology. In an age when intelligence could change the fate of armies, diaries became as valuable as decoded telegrams. U.S. Military Intelligence Service Bulletin, Jan 1944. Behind this policy stood not only officers, but also psychologists, engineers and intelligence specialists. At Fort Hunt, Virginia, in a top-secret facility known only by its postal address, P.O. Box 1142, interrogators quietly studied the writings of captured German and Japanese prisoners. The analysts were not only linguists, they were engineers, professors, and cultural experts recruited for their ability to decode patterns of thought. They treated the diaries as living blueprints of enemy mentality. While much attention went to German technical notes on U-boats or rockets, Japanese journals revealed subtler truths: despair at defeat, doubt about commanders, and admiration for the enemy's overwhelming logistics. Office of Strategic Services interrogation files. 1944. The technical system for gathering these writings was surprisingly methodical. Prisoners were allowed to keep their notebooks, but often copies were discreetly taken. Clerks, sometimes Japanese-American Nisei linguists recruited through the Military Intelligence Service Language School at Camp Savage, Minnesota, painstakingly translated entries. Their skill was unmatched. Many had grown up speaking Japanese at home, giving them an ear for nuance that formal translators lacked. These young linguists, children of immigrants whose loyalty was often questioned, now wielded a decisive role. They transformed fragments of poetry, laments, or even coded references into actionable intelligence. Without them, the voices inside those pages would have remained locked in kanji. MIS Language School Training Records, 1943. But beyond intelligence, there was another advantage: control. Commanders knew that prisoners given structure, food, work, reading, and writing, were far less likely to riot or resist. A journal was not only a record of thought, it was a valve for tension. Guards noticed fewer fights and fewer suicides in camps where writing was common. In psychological terms, the diary became an invisible guard, keeping men's energy directed inward rather than outward. "The pen," wrote one Army psychiatrist, "is a quieter guard than the rifle." U.S. Army Medical Corps Memo, 1944. Yet the Japanese prisoners themselves struggled to make sense of this allowance. Many clung to the belief that their notebooks were being exploited, that every line would be turned against them. One prisoner in a dramatized composite wrote, "They want to know if we dream of escape, if we miss Japan, if we still worship the emperor. They pretend it is freedom, but it is their weapon." This suspicion mirrored the broader disbelief within the Japanese High Command, which assumed that American treatment of POWs would mirror their own: brutal, degrading, designed to break men rather than preserve them. In Tokyo, officers dismissed reports of humane treatment as propaganda. To them, the notion that enemy soldiers would be encouraged to write journals was unthinkable. Imperial Japanese Army Staff Meeting Notes, 1944. As the policy matured, its effectiveness became clear on the battlefield. Nowhere was this more evident than during the Battle of Saipan. June 15 to July 9, 1944. American forces, landing with 127,000 men supported by naval bombardment, faced a determined Japanese garrison of 32,000 troops under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. U.S. Navy War Diary, June 1944. Fighting was ferocious. Banzai charges shredded against Marine rifle lines, and suicide assaults turned the island's ridges into killing grounds. But amidst the carnage, captured prisoners, rare survivors dragged from caves or pulled from the sea, were treated in ways they did not expect. Given food, shelter, and sometimes even notebooks, they began to reveal their shock in writing. "The enemy feeds us while we bleed," one entry recorded. "Their supplies seem endless, their care unnatural. Our commanders said they would kill us. They do not." Captured Diary, Saipan Collection, 1944. This revelation mattered. For every Japanese soldier who survived capture, dozens witnessed their treatment. Rumors spread among garrisons that Americans treated prisoners with strange generosity. Though it did not stop men from fighting to the death, it planted seeds of doubt in an army built on absolute faith in imperial commands. Even small cracks in morale had value. As intelligence officers noted, the greatest weapon is not the rifle or the bomb, but the prisoner who returns home alive, carrying stories of how the enemy treated him. May's interrogation summary, July 1944. Technically, the system required infrastructure. Factories across America produced not only tanks and planes, but also the mundane supplies that sustained POW camps. Companies like Mead Paper Mills and Dixon Ticonderoga were wartime suppliers of notebooks and pencils. Though insignificant compared to the Detroit Arsenal tank plant or Boeing's bomber lines, these civilian industries contributed quietly to the war effort. The war was fought not only with steel and fuel, but with pulp, ink, and graphite, tools that shaped hearts and minds as effectively as weapons. War Production Board Report, 1944. In Saipan's aftermath, the power of diaries intersected with intelligence breakthroughs. Prisoner writings revealed confusion about Japanese supply chains, disbelief at American amphibious strength, and even hints of troop morale before battle. One prisoner wrote, "We were told we would starve the enemy, that their ships could not cross the ocean. Yet their food is sweeter than ours. Their ships like mountains." POW Diary Translation, Miss Archive, 1944. Such entries reinforced what logistics officers already knew. The American industrial machine was unassailable, but hearing it from enemy voices carried psychological weight that charts and statistics could not match. The enemy's disbelief echoed in captured officer statements. In a dramatized composite, one Imperial captain muttered during interrogation, "We could not understand why your men laughed while marching, why your prisoners wrote books in your camps. In our world, a soldier has no laughter and no words." These words underscored the chasm between Japanese doctrine and American practice. For the Allies, morale and humanity were strategic tools. For the Japanese, they were liabilities. The clash of philosophies was as decisive as artillery. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Prisoner Interrogation Notes, 1946. By 1945, as the war neared its climax, the American policy of allowing journals had proven its worth. It provided insight, it preserved order, and it became part of a broader propaganda narrative. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions in the Philippines carried images of smiling prisoners eating American rations, subtly implying that capture did not mean dishonor. Though many Japanese dismissed these as lies, those who had seen diaries or spoken to prisoners knew otherwise. The contradiction between what Tokyo demanded and what America offered grew sharper with every campaign. Office of War Information Psychological Warfare Report, 1945. But the true impact of this policy went beyond intelligence or propaganda. It reshaped the prisoners themselves. Some later testified that the act of writing saved them from despair. One man recalled after the war, "The notebook became my friend. It listened when no one else could. It gave me reason to wake each day." POW Oral History Project, 1972. In an ironic twist, the very tool meant to control and study them became a path to survival, even healing. The paradox remained unresolved. To the guards, diaries were paperwork. To the prisoners, they were lifelines. To the strategists, they were weapons. And to the Japanese High Command, they were a humiliation. Proof that their men had been allowed to think freely in captivity. The practice exposed a fundamental truth. The American war effort was not just measured in bombs and bullets, but in an openness of mind that their adversaries could scarcely comprehend. And as the Pacific War thundered toward its apocalyptic conclusion, that clash of philosophies, freedom versus control, words versus silence, would shape not only the outcome of battles, but the post-war memory of captivity itself. The journals, once dismissed as scraps of paper, had become evidence of something larger, that in modern war, even the smallest allowances could carry strategic weight. But the ultimate question lingered, unanswered in the smoke of battlefields. What legacy would these fragile notebooks leave when the war was over, and the men returned to a homeland that demanded silence? By the summer of 1945, the strange allowance that once baffled Japanese prisoners, the right to keep journals, had rippled far beyond the fences of America's POW camps. What began as an experiment in order and intelligence now shaped strategy, psychology, and even the memory of the war itself. For the American military, the decision proved to be more than leniency. It became a tool that undermined enemy doctrine at its core. For the Japanese, it was an enduring wound, one that revealed the fragility of an empire that demanded silence and obedience, yet found its soldiers writing freely under the gaze of their captors. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The strategic effect was subtle but profound. By permitting expression, American commanders created a living archive of enemy psychology. Every notebook captured, every translated line became another data point in understanding Japanese morale. Analysts compiled reports on how soldiers described their commanders, how they interpreted defeat, even how they viewed American technology. "They believe our tanks are endless," one report noted, "and our aircraft like steel birds that never tire." Military Intelligence Service Translation File, 1944. These perceptions were as valuable as troop counts or supply figures. They revealed not just what the Japanese army was, but what it believed itself to be, and what it thought of its enemy. The psychological toll ran deeper still. For Japanese soldiers, writing in captivity represented a fracture in loyalty. Diaries preserved thoughts that could not be spoken aloud: fear, hunger, longing for home, doubt in victory. In the imperial system, such weakness was to be buried, silenced, or expunged. But on American soil, it was inked into permanence. "We wrote words we could not even think in uniform," one prisoner later recalled. Post-war testimony, 1953. The act itself was transformative. For some, it became a step toward surviving defeat. For others, it carried the sting of betrayal, of having confessed humanity where only devotion to the emperor was expected. American propagandists understood the power of this contradiction. Pamphlets distributed across Pacific battlefields included excerpts from prisoner diaries, carefully selected to highlight confusion, doubt, or even admiration of the enemy's treatment. Leaflets read, "Your comrades eat well in our camps. They sleep safely. They write freely." For frontline Japanese soldiers, such words were deeply unsettling. Even if dismissed as lies, the possibility that they were true gnawed at certainty. To men drilled in the belief that capture meant torture, the idea that prisoners lived better than soldiers still in the field was corrosive. Office of War Information, Leaflet Campaign Report, 1945. The practice also had a lasting influence on American doctrine. Military psychologists, many of whom had cut their teeth on analyzing POW journals, later carried their insights into the Cold War. They argued that morale, perception, and cultural understanding were as decisive as firepower. The U.S. Army's post-war manuals increasingly emphasized not just killing the enemy, but knowing him, his beliefs, his fears, his cultural codes. The lessons drawn from a few thousand diaries in Wisconsin and Iowa echoed decades later in Korea, Vietnam, and even Iraq, where hearts and minds became a military mantra. U.S. Army Field Manual FM 35, 1956. The human cost of this story, however, cannot be overlooked. For the men inside those camps, writing was not simply intelligence fodder or psychological leverage. It was survival. Prisoners who filled notebooks often reported lower levels of despair. Psychiatrists noted that men who wrote daily were less likely to attempt suicide or sink into withdrawal. Army Medical Observation Report, 1945. Engineers and factory workers who had built the pencils and paper unknowingly contributed to this lifeline. Their wartime production, extending not only to tanks and bombers, but also to the fragile threads of human endurance. In this way, America's industrial machine sustained not just its own soldiers, but its enemies as well, feeding and clothing them and through journals, granting them a measure of voice. Yet the paradox of silence and speech haunted many Japanese prisoners after the war. When they returned home, diaries in hand or memory, they faced a homeland shattered by defeat and shame. Some destroyed their writings immediately, fearing condemnation. Others hid them away, only to be discovered decades later in family trunks or estate sales. A few daringly published them, turning private reflections into public testimony. These works astonished Japanese readers, who learned for the first time that their soldiers had been treated humanely, even generously, in American camps. The revelation clashed violently with wartime propaganda, which had depicted Allied captivity as a fate worse than death. Japanese Cultural Study, 1964. For historians, these journals became priceless. They preserved voices that would otherwise have been lost, the thoughts of ordinary soldiers caught between indoctrination and survival. Some entries read like battlefield memoirs, others like poetry. One prisoner wrote, "Snow falls on the barbed wire. In the silence I hear the river beyond. My pen moves, though my country does not know me anymore." POW Diary, Camp McCoy collection. Such words bridge the gap between enemies, reminding future generations that even in war, humanity persisted. The contrast between American openness and Japanese silence shaped post-war memory. Allied veterans who guarded camps often spoke of their surprise at how prisoners adjusted, even thrived when given small freedoms. "They were men, same as us," one veteran recalled decades later. "Once they had paper and food, they stopped being the enemy and became just people." Veterans Oral History Project, 1981. For the Japanese, however, the memory was more complicated. Diaries represented survival, but also humiliation, the acknowledgement that they had lived in defeat while others had died in battle. This duality made the journals both treasure and burden. The legacy of these writings extended beyond individuals. In academic circles, they challenged stereotypes. They showed Japanese soldiers not as fanatics beyond reason, but as complex men capable of reflection, doubt, and even admiration of the enemy. They revealed the cultural chasm between two militaries, one that demanded silence, another that permitted speech. In doing so, they illuminated a broader truth about World War II itself, that battles were fought not only with weapons, but with ideas of freedom, humanity, and identity. The story ends where it began, with disbelief. Even decades later, surviving Japanese POWs often shook their heads when asked about their journals. "We could not believe it then," one said in a dramatized composite, "and I still cannot believe it now, that the enemy let us write when our own army would not." That disbelief lingers as both accusation and revelation. It accuses the imperial system that denied voice to its soldiers, and it reveals the strange, quiet power of an enemy who allowed them to speak. The war closed with atomic fire, Japan's surrender, and the shattering of an empire. Yet within the ruins, fragments of diaries survived, scribbled lines on yellowed paper, fading ink from prison barracks thousands of miles away. They remind us that wars are not only fought in steel and blood, but in the spaces where silence is broken and words endure. As one American intelligence officer wrote at war's end, "In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and freedom of voice defeats silence." Final Miss Report, Dec 1945. And so the journals remain, testaments to a paradox that confounded soldiers, reshaped intelligence, and left a legacy far beyond the fences of captivity. In their fragile pages lies a universal lesson that sometimes the greatest victory is not in silencing an enemy, but in allowing him to speak.